Welcome back to the Sports Booth YouTube channel. You're joined once again by myself and Hughesy. What we've just done is our podcast on That Rugby podcast, where in that podcast I've broken down my top 10 players ever. None of them currently play, so they've all got a little asterisk who are currently playing. But what we've done is I've given that top 10, so if you listen to the podcast, you're now here after the podcast, listening to our post-podcast chat as we break down.
Hence the name post-podcast chat, you know? You listen to the podcast, then you listen to the PPC.
Exactly. PPC, baby. Yeah. So we're going to break down the top 10 now. I had some honourable mentions, Brian Habana, Jerome Kono, and Bowden Barrett, who I think will eventually get in there. Any of those that kind of... I left Eben Etzebeth off there, but I think he will be another one that by time goes.
Yeah, that sort of eventually gets up there. Yeah, look, for me, your 9 and your 10, I think, are probably going to throw up the most questions from people on social media about why they're there, because I guess they're not part of those typical nations you think about when you think of the top rugby players ever. So really, you'd be thinking about England, France, Ireland from the Northern Hemisphere, Wales as well, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia from the Southern Hemisphere. And then you've gone with, at 9 and 10, you've gone with a Georgian and you've gone with an Italian. Now, I think you might have the majority of South Africa out for your blood by not putting Brian Habana on this list, with those two ahead of him. That's my initial reaction to 9 and 10. And I think the Victor Matfield call was another big one. And then to only have one Aussie on the list as well, I think was also controversial.
Yeah, my thing with those two, Sergio Paris and Mamuka Gugordze, those two lifted the nations to another level. So in Italy, you know, rugby wasn't even a tier 1 sport. He came around and took them to another level where they were competitive in the Six Nations, and now we see them where they are now, losing just about every game by a margin of less than 10 points, most likely. And the same with Mamuka Gugordze, where he lifted Georgia to another level where there was now discussions about them coming into the Six Nations.
I guess, for me, it's like that is stuff to consider them for like a Hall of Fame, right? That makes them Hall of Fame players. But does that make them the 10 best players, right? It really depends on that operative word there, best, you know. And the way I look at best is, all right, if we were ranking these players on like a Madden or a Rugby 08 skill level, you know, who's going to be a 99 overall and who's going to be below that? So whose ranking would be higher than whose? I think you would say that Habana's ranking, his skill and what he could do on the field would be higher than what those two could do, like what he did on the field. Like, and I guess that you're taking into account a lot of the off the field in terms of bringing these nations into some sort of relevance within the rugby world. And I think that, I don't know, it depends on how you look at best, because if you're looking at best for not just the best, it's just and best player as well. You know, you haven't that's one of your criteria, I think certainly make a case for it there, right? But then I think you can also make a case for someone like a George Gregan or a John Eales to be on the list as well, because they further elevated rugby in Australia as well. Because that is peak Australia, and this is why when in my Mount Rushmore I put John Eales on there, because that was peak Australian rugby when he was captaining the Wallabies. That made it into a major sport in Australia, up and above, beyond and above what it had been previously, right? That made the Wallabies one of the premier teams in the world, and really stamped the Wallabies into the identity of Australia, right? And so I think if you're looking at that, you know, you've really got to probably, I think, put some more weight for a John Eales type over those two, because Australia's a bigger nation as well, and Australia's had bigger results as a result of their contributions to rugby.
I totally agree with a lot of what you said, I think, and especially you talk about those Madden or Rugby 08 ratings, I think Habana will be higher. I think if either of those two players are born in New Zealand, South Africa, Australia, then we're discussing that they're the best players on the planet. So that's where my discussion comes from, is we shouldn't judge them based off who they played for and what team they played with around, when I think actually if you put Sergio Paris up against any other number 8 in the world, even Kieran Reid, I think if he was the All Blacks number 8 at the same time as Kieran Reid, I think he's a better number 8 than Kieran Reid. So that's where I've gone with it. And it's hard.
I think that's fair enough then.
Apples and oranges. Like, again, Brian Habana was one of those big ones. Was, do I leave one of those two out when Habana's one of the best wingers? But I looked around and I said, I think Habana's low enough, further enough down than David Campese that he's not at that level. He's not at a Jonah Lomu level. He's just outside of it. And so, yeah, that's why I went with that. And that's the same reason Oz Durant made it. When you're comparing apples and oranges, you've got to, chuck a watermelon in there of Oz Durant in a prop and see how does his stats. And that's why I think a 2 World Cup winner is massive in my eyes. So Dan Carter, Richie McCaw both did that, and Oz Durant as well. When you're looking at that, and I know now, I think it'll be easier going forward, especially when you look at players who have won multiple Players of the Year. I think the Player of the Year started in like 2001. And so it's easy to look there and go, yeah, Dan Carter, I think, won it 3 times. Richie McCaw, I think, won it twice. Stuff like that, I can go easy. They've given the Players Award. Like DuPont, I think, will end up on this list if he continues on his trajectory because he's been nominated already like twice or 3 times, won it once. Same with Bowden Barrett, he's won it twice. So those are going to be easier to judge. When you look back, it's hard to judge those teams. Again, we're looking at Sergio Paris and Mamuka Gagordze, who, are never going to be nominated for that award because they're not on a good enough team. And then you look at players like David Campese, who came before that award, Oz Durant, whose best rugby probably came before that award, Jonah Lomu as well, Gareth Edwards, all those players who came before that award.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's hard to, because we're reaching back into the annals of rugby, really. For some of these players, so it is hard to compare, and it's hard, the game has changed as well. Look, I think you make a really compelling argument for those two as well. So look, I'm not necessarily unhappy that they're in there. I guess it's just it's interesting to know sort of the what your view of best player means. So I think I think you make a really good argument for if they were born in one of those really tier 1 nations, like I guess World Cup winning nations, we have a different conversation about their place in rugby history as compared to where we sort of view them now. Moving sort of from the bottom, I think Johnny Wilkinson has rightfully earned his place there. If for nothing else, the drop goal at the World Cup is just made him iconic in terms of rugby. I think that's. And I remember last week you asked me on the podcast, or maybe it was the post-podcast chat, would I rather kick a drop goal to win a World Cup or kick a conversion to win a World Cup? I think I'd rather kick. I said I'd kick the conversion, right? Because it means we scored a try. And as well, I want to add on to that, kicking the drop goal, that's already been done by Johnny Wilkinson, right? You'll forever be compared to Johnny Wilkinson alone in that conversation. Whereas your conversions, so many of them have happened that you could still sort of stand on your own. It's almost like if you're in a field and there's 2 trees ahead of you, you're just going to compare the 2 trees. But if there's a whole forest in front of you, you're not going to compare all of the trees in the forest, right? You just find sort of the best looking tree and say this is the best looking tree, right? You're not going to then talk down the other shitty trees. You're just going to look at that tree. But if you're the second drop goal in history, you're always going to be looked down on as compared to Johnny Wilkinson.
Yeah, the only way you could beat Johnny is if it's 50 plus type thing. Like, it'd have to be something ridiculous. You're not wrong. I like that.
Exactly. So that for me, that adds to why I'd rather kick a conversion. And I think, but the fact, but then leading back to Johnny Wilkinson, he's made that so iconic. It is just that moment, that World Cup is just his. Nothing else in that World Cup matters except for his.
Do you reckon that's the most iconic moment in rugby ever?
I think so. I think so. Like, I think when people think about, I mean, I guess for me, maybe it feels that way because it's an early rugby memory that's seared into my brain, part of me growing up. There's that for me, there's that. And then there's obviously Bernard Foley's penalty conversion to win the 2014 Super Rugby for the Waratahs. I think that's pretty damn iconic as well. But it's at a lower level than the World Cup. So you have to argue that the World Cup one is greater because it's in by a wider audience. David Campese, I'm happy you've put at least one Aussie in there. I think there's an argument to be made for two, as opposed to three Kiwis. But then you look at the three Kiwis, you're like, okay, well, it's hard to argue that any of these three shouldn't be on the list and shouldn't be as high as they are, right? So, Oz Durant, I like that inclusion as well. Sort of the prototypical front row of what you think a front row looks like. And what's interesting to me is he's got the body of someone that I've seen so many times playing subbies rugby. He just looks like a subbies rugby prop, but he was just so good at what he did that he was so successful for the Springboks.
I think very similar to what Jonah Lomu did to rugby, Oz Durant revolutionised propping. Like he was doing what the props do today before the props, as in big men wouldn't be moved, knew how to scrum. He knew exactly what his role was and stuck to it. And I think he revolutionised that prop position.
Yeah. Then you've got iconic John Olomu in there, Gareth Edwards, Brian O'Driscoll. So the Northern Hemisphere getting some love as well. And then Dan Carter, Richie McCaw. Look, the top five of your list don't have much to say about really. I'd probably be pretty similar to my top five as well. I'd probably swap Edwards and Olomu though, because
it's so hard with Edwards because all I've heard is stories. Stories, seen a couple of clips, but all you do is read stories. It's like is it a myth? Is actually Gareth Edwards as good as eight? But I'm taking people's words for it. There's so many people who have said how good he was. It's one of those ones you wish you could have watched it. Watching MJ in his prime. You wish you could have watched that now that we've seen LeBron. So
and I think. Yeah, I what you said in the podcast about Dan Carter, I think is true. I think Richie, I look at it like this, right? It's similar to Cam Smith and Billy Slater, I think, for the Melbourne Storm. Now, Cam Smith would widely be for a lot of people would be considered as like the best player in rugby league history. He's the longest tenured, won so many championships, Origins, premierships, World Cups, but I think Billy Slater was the better player in that sort of trio of Melbourne Storm players because I would always fear what Billy Slater could do to me. Cam Smith was seen as the annoyance, right? He was the leader who would get the team there. And I see that similar with Dan Carter and Richard McCaw. Richard McCaw was the captain, he led the team, right? But Dan Carter, as the individual player, was who I would fear more. If I could choose to take one of them off the field, I would choose to take Dan Carter off the field as opposed to Richie McCaw.
That's a good way.
Richie McCaw elevated all the other players around him, but Dan Carter didn't need elevating. Dan Carter was already at that pinnacle. He was above that level, right? He was just better than all the other players, and was just a heartbreaker so many times. I remember so many times, so many games where it was a Dan Carter conversion or a Dan Carter penalty that just sunk the hopes of the Aussies, as well as what he could do with ball in hand. And that just continual clutch gene it just puts him over the top where he just, you knew when he was lining up to do it, it was automatic that he would make this. This was what he did. He was just born to do that. I think you made really good points during the podcast that Richie McCaw was all effort, all heart. But at the end of the day, Dan Carter could just do more on the field.
Totally. You've just made my point double sum. So that is my top 10. Bit of a dive into it on this post-podcast chat. Thank you for joining us today. We will be back next week again with a post-podcast chat for Hughesy's top 10 when he drops his next week on the podcast. So make sure you are tuned for that. For now, thank you for joining us. We will see you next time on the Sports Booth. Goodbye.
Peace.